Imposter syndrome. Let's talk about it. Very common phenomenon, especially in my industry as a video game developer, where you're consistently being put on teams with super heavyweight champions who've made some of the games that you grew up with. What is that like? How do we deal with it? Imposter syndrome. Let's break it down. Imposter syndrome is when you feel that you are presenting as something different than you are. The most common example is when you feel you're presenting as a bit of an expert, but you are in fact a novice. So you feel like you are presenting as somebody who has more skills than you actually have, and that makes you feel a sense that you don't really belong, that you're being a bit of a faker, an imposter, hence the title, right? So that's the idea. It's come up in my career for sure. I felt like an imposter on certain teams. In my professional experience, I've also felt like that in university. I went to a great university. There was a lot of really awesome people there, and at times I felt like, oh shit, do I deserve to be here? Am I an imposter because I'm pretending to be awesome maybe, when in fact perhaps I'm not awesome, right? So that's the imposter syndrome in a nutshell. And there are basically there's only two ways that you can fix imposter syndrome, because it's an internal conflict, right? It's you feeling like you're, not quite what you're pretending to be. So there's only two ways to fix this. The first way is you can convince yourself that you are what you're pretending to be. So if you feel like you're a novice, but you're pretending to be an expert, there's a discontinuity there. So the very first, simplest solution is, instead of feeling like a novice, you can feel like an expert. And then you feel like what you're presenting yourself to be. That's the first way to fix the problem. And that's actually a very viable approach in some situations. We'll talk about it in a moment. But first, let's just cover the second option, which is you can no longer present as the thing that you feel you're not. So if you don't feel like you're an expert, then the second option is to no longer present as an expert. You can present as the novice you believe yourself to be, and that's another great way to deal with imposter syndrome, and it's actually the one I think is easiest to do. So let's go through both of these options and figure out which one might be good for you. Again, I don't think one is necessarily better. It's kind of situation dependent, and both can be very effective. So let's start with that second one first, which is that you, instead of pretending to be an expert, you instead own up to being a novice. So this could be, you're on a team and you feel like everybody else is like an expert and they're super amazing, and you're like, shit, I don't feel like I'm an expert. I feel like I kind of suck at this. I feel like I'm still learning. That's the key of it there, really. You want to approach this with a growth mindset, and you just want to say, you know what? I am not that thing. I am not an expert. Maybe you can say you're new to this. Maybe you can say that you haven't done something like this before. It's a unique skill set for you. It's something you haven't focused on, perhaps. But the key point here is just to approach it with a growth mindset and say, maybe I'm not an expert, but I'm just not an expert yet. I can still become an expert. I can still get better at this. And if you can own that, I think a lot of the social anxiety can go away, right? So for example, let's say you were just hired to a new company, and you're working on the team, and you've only been there for a month, and everybody else who's been there for a year is amazing. You might think to yourself, okay, well, maybe I'm presenting as somebody who's been here for a year, but in fact, I should just present as someone who's only been here for a week, or I've only been here for a month. If you're the new guy, then you should just own up to being the new guy. And you could say, you know what? I'm not at that level yet because they have more experience than me. And they didn't hire me as an expert. They hired me as somebody who was going to learn and maybe be the first person on the job. Right? This is something that is a common experience for new hires, right? Someone who's maybe starting their career. If you were hired as an associate level programmer, right, which is like the lowest programmer, or junior programmer, you might say, then they didn't expect you to be a senior programmer, right? Otherwise, they would have hired you as a senior programmer. So you should just own the fact that you're junior, that you're learning. Try to soak it up. Be a sponge, as they say. Try to get as much learning as you can out of the situation. And really, if somebody says, hey, you made a mistake here, say, own up to it. Apologize if that's situationally appropriate, and say, You know what? I'm still learning. I'm not an expert yet, but I'm excited to be here. I'm super happy to learn. I've been learning at a super fast rate. Look at where I've come since, whenever I started this discipline. And because of that, I'm going to get to an expert eventually, right? So I think that that's probably the best way to approach imposter syndrome. However, I can understand there's a lot of social situations perhaps where you don't want to be perceived as a novice, right? So I think the most important thing, right, is to just try to contextualize the skill set or whatever the discipline is, because you want to say, oh, I'm not an idiot. I'm just new to this particular thing, right? It's not that I'm an unskilled person. It's just that I haven't worked with this particular framework before. Or I haven't worked with this particular set of situations before. As much as you can contextualize that, you'll feel less like an idiot overall, and you'll just feel like a situational idiot. And I think that's a lot easier to cope with, because nobody wants to come home at the end of the day and be like, oh man, I'm such an idiot, right? But if you're like, oh, this is something new and this is a unique challenge, you could look at it as a bit of a growth opportunity. I think that's always a better way to approach it. So that's the first way that I would recommend most people deal with imposter syndrome. But the other way is also very viable, and that's to just try and convince yourself that you are in fact whatever you're presenting to be, right? And this is also very common the case, which is that people feel, people feel maybe a little self-conscious. I forgot what the word is, but maybe they don't have enough confidence, and because of that, maybe you are hired as a senior programmer, but you got self-doubt. You feel like, darn, I don't know if I really am a senior programmer, because maybe I just got the job because, my uncle works at the company and he gave me a positive recommendation, or a friend or something like that, right? So there's other ways we could approach that as well. There's no there's no lack of places from where you can draw confidence. Really, there's so many options for you. But I think one of the most important things is just to think through the past and what's happened in order to land you in this situation. So, for example, let's say you got interviewed for a company, you take the job, and you think, oh shit, I am not qualified for this position. I'm underqualified. Well, if that's the case, I would say lean on your trust and your faith of the process that got you there. So if they interviewed you, then you passed the interview, and you are somebody who has proven to them, at least in the context of the interview, that you can get the job done, right? And if you employed some, let's say, equivocation in the context of that interview, right? Maybe you presented some facts that from a different angle would seem, you might judge their veracity, which is all in all to say you may have lied. Then that was a skill set you've expressed, right? You've expressed your ability to perhaps charm or outwit, or maybe, let's say, deceive people in such a way that it was fortuitous for you and you could do it again. So that's a skill set that they have, in a sense, judged, right? After all, this is a little bit duplicitous, right? And I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but it's an option, which is to say, if you've taken a test and someone in this test has judged your ability to, let's say, do math problems, but through the duration of the test, you have found a way to cheat in such a way that you have gotten the right answer without maybe having full understanding of how to do math, you can perceive this test as not a judgment of your math skills, but instead a judgment of your ability to get the right answer. And if your cunning and your deceitfulness was perhaps the skill which you used in order to surpass the test and win, then you could use it again, right? And then that is a valid metric of your skill, right? Because at the end of the day, they want to know if you got the right answer. They don't want to know if you did it the right way, right? At least most tests, right? You would say. So obviously, I wouldn't recommend that. But that is one way to look at the problem. And I think in some ways, it's a very valid way. There's certainly a lot of situations where it is fortuitous and probably the best option to lie. One example might be, let's say you are the leader of a team and you don't have 100% confidence in your team. It's very important as a leader to inspire your subordinates with the faith that you believe in them and that you think they could get it done. And so sometimes it is, I think, situationally appropriate and it probably the best course of action to inspire people with faith. And faith is absolute trust, right? Faith is absolute trust, even perhaps in the light against maybe perhaps your better judgment, right? Faith is absolute trust against perhaps your intuition, perhaps even against your own reasoning and your own judgment. Faith is absolute trust, perhaps blind trust at times. But it's important, especially in a situation like that where you're their leader and if you don't have faith in them, if you don't believe in them and they feel you don't believe in them, then that could really collapse a situation. So I think equivocation is it's an asset, right? And it's something that we need to employ selectively, and we need to be careful because, hey man, if you getting caught in a lie is usually worse than giving the wrong answer, right? Almost always we want to be truthful. And we want to present the facts as we know them. But there's a lot of cases where it does make sense to equivocate. So that's all I'll say about that. But basically, what you want to do if you're going to go with this approach with respect to imposter syndrome is you want to convince yourself that you are what you're saying you are. And you can find that confidence from a lot of ways. So we just talked about the process. We talked about, hey, they interviewed me. I passed the test. And so I've got the skills by hook or by crook, as they say sometimes. I've made it this far and I can get further. I've just got to double down on my experience, and I've just gonna, I've just got to trust in the process, and what got me here will get me further, right? So that's one way to do it. Another way is you just want to think about everything else that's led to this point. There's this pastor, okay, a proselytizer. His name's Joel Osteen, right? This is a bit of a famous proselytizer because he is known for maybe doing things that are not very Christian, right? He had this giant megachurch, and there were these people with this flood, and he said, no, you can't stay in my megachurch. You've got to live out on the streets, because he didn't want them to, dirty the upholstery in his megachurch, right? So this is a guy who I don't necessarily like. But he has this great quote, which is that he was in a situation, I think it was he went to a fancy college or something like that, and the fathers of his peers were prestigious. So I believe it was the case he was talking to somebody, and that guy's dad was like, his last name was the same as the name of the building they were taking the classes in, right? Because that guy's dad was very prestigious, and so he came from a long line of prestigious gentlemen, and so because that guy's father was very impressive, he felt, oh shit, I come from nothing. Maybe my dad, is somebody from a history of penury, somebody who is not significant, let's say, in this arbitrary standard, and so because of that, I feel unworthy. Well, what Joel Osteen did is he said, you know what, your father was impressive, but he thought to himself, my heavenly Father, God, is the creator not of this building, not of this school, but of the fucking universe, right? He went to his faith and he said, you know what, my heavenly Father, my God, is the creator of all things. And so because of that, he imbued in me, his likeness. He imbued in me an ability to get it done. And so what this guy did was he resorted to his faith in order to inspire himself, despite maybe not having a prestigious upbringing. And that was enough to give him the confidence he needed to go into the conversation and assert himself as a confident gentleman, right? So that was basically one way which he dealt with it. And I mean, what is faith, right? Obviously, for people who don't believe in it, it's just it's just something made up, right? But so is any kind of faith, right? So I feel like that's a really valid way in order for you to psych yourself up, right? If you believe, right, this is like a Christian doctrine, a Judeo-Christian doctrine, which is like that God made himself, made humans in his image, right? If you truly believe that, then you don't believe then that God would make a human that looked like him, but was also an idiot, right? You wouldn't paint a self-portrait and make yourself look ugly, right? So surely if God was going to imbue his likeness into this sentient creature, he would imbue a capability into that creature, right? And so if you believe you're, God's, one of chosen God's people, or you're a descendant of Jesus, or some nonsense like that, then you can believe in this faith, right? So that's just one example of how this guy got through it, right? He used his faith in order to inspire him and get that confidence. But like I said, there's a plethora of opportunities, right? You could say, oh, the interview is what got me here. Or you can say, you know what, I've done something in the past, and that's a good achievement, and that's got me here, and the work I do now will get me to where I want to be. So that's another way to do it. So in summary, if you're feeling an imposter syndrome, which is to say, you feel like you're not who you're presenting to be, you can either start presenting as the person you feel you truly are, or you can work on convincing yourself that you are the person that you're presenting to be. Both valid options, both useful in certain situations. And, I've used both of them in my career, and I think it's been, and it really is situationally dependent, but I think there's a lot of ways to deal with this imposter syndrome. So if you've dealt with imposter syndrome in one way or another, or you have hot takes, maybe you want to reflect on any of the experiences I shared, or maybe have a different opinion, I welcome the discussion. Definitely leave it in the comments section. Hit the like button if you want to hear more videos like this of just sort of talking about topics like this off the cuff. I'm always happy to engage with that stuff. And I appreciate you for watching. Thank you so much for coming to the channel. Hit subscribe if you want to see more. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.